To be with everyone. I got on a little early, so I enjoyed being able to watch the boxes appear and see a lot of good friends, some colleagues, and a number of people I haven't seen in a long time. So I'm thankful to Lisa for helping to organize these and to President Ray for the invitation. It's been gratifying to watch the sustained interest in these conversations as we move through the weeks. You'll recall we began with Ken Stone reflecting on the Hebrew Bible's use of lament as a potential resource for our congregations during this pandemic crisis. We moved on to Joanne Terrell reflecting theologically with us and placing the pandemic within the framework of Holy Week. The suffering solidarity that we experience on Friday, the descent into hell on Saturday, God penetrating into the farthest reaches of chaos in order to redeem, and then the hope of Sunday. And then last week, Christoph Ringer called us to construct what he described as a new moral imagination that would orient us once again toward what the CTS vision statement calls greater justice and mercy. My contribution today to this deepening reflection is to encourage us to consider the meaning, even the mystery of this pandemic. Thus far, as I have watched and listened and read, religious communities we're associated with have largely focused on three major themes. First is hope, and we've seen how communities have drawn from our religious texts and our traditions and our practices, including various observances of Holy Week, the past Seder, and soon Ramadan gatherings, how they've all been used to encourage us, to give us hope, to remind us that we will get through this. So we ring bells, we bang on pots and pans, we light candles, we put teddy bears in windows, and we're reminding each other that there is reason to hope and there's goodness in the world. The second theme has been accompaniment, as we've maintained connection with our religious communities and with others through various kinds of old and new technologies, Skype and Zoom and email, and yes, even the good old telephone. And third, compassionate response, addressing the immediate needs of our various wider communities through things like emergency relief funds and food pantries and volunteerism and the like. And all this has been impressive, and thus far it's been very sustained, and that's been good to watch. And yet I've sensed caution when it comes to engaging the deeper questions of meaning. Some of this, of course, is timing, I'm sure. In a crisis, we naturally and appropriately address the immediate, the urgent, the essential, but I think we also resist delving into questions of meaning in large measure because of our appropriately allergic reaction to simplistic and harmful linkages between alleged cause and effect, namely between human behavior and God's judgment. I watched or read 3 sermons on Easter. Each of them spent a good deal of time reminding us that the pandemic is not God's judgment, and I agree. But my question is whether it's enough to simply say that the pandemic is a public health crisis, no more and no less. Shouldn't we have more to say? And shouldn't our religious communities expect more from us? We need not become Job's friends or the people around Jesus who question whether the man born blind was responsible for his affliction because of his sin or whether it was a result of his parents' sin. God may not be doing this because of who we are or how we behaved. But what is happening to us may, if we're courageously honest, teach us about who we really are, personally, and perhaps more important, before God. Today, I want to propose that we consider thinking of the pandemic as humiliation. The pandemic as humiliation. To put it starkly, the pandemic has humiliated us. This may strike you as rather odd at best and offensive at worst. After all, in contemporary usage, humiliation is generally associated with things like bullying and shame. But its ancient Latin root, along with humble and humility, is meaning earth or soil or ground. So that to be humiliated, in its most literal sense, is to be brought down to earth, to have our illusions unveiled. It means to be grounded, which, of course, is how many of us are feeling right now. It's to have our vanities exposed, our pretensions punctured. In this sense, the pandemic has indeed become a humiliation, global in scale, yet very personal as well. Think about pandemic as humiliation. The pandemic has confronted us with the fact that we share fully in the finite and the limited contingent character of creation itself. We too are subject to inevitable death and not always on our timetable. The liturgical admonition that invited us into Lent this year, remember that you are dust and to dust you shall return, suddenly has moved on from intellectual acknowledgement to the gut level, humiliation. The pandemic has exposed the vain assumptions that we have about our comfortable world, revealing the broken, shattered bones and bleeding bodies of our common life, which we so often conveniently ignore in what we have called normal times. But by way of illustration, the death rates among African Americans as opposed to white Americans, the real need, the sudden willingness of the Chicago public schools to spend $75 million in order to get technology and access to underprivileged and disadvantaged children in the district, technology that their peers in other parts of the district and certainly in school districts beyond have had as a matter of course for years. Or consider the inability or unwillingness of employers to provide protective wear and safe working conditions for low-wage immigrant workers, essential workers. All of this reveals the dishonesty of those assumptions in what Christoph last week I thought brilliantly described as an apocalyptic unveiling. It's a humiliation. The pandemic brings our nation down from the high horse of our exceptionalism. No border wall, no immigrant ban, no tariff, no nuclear stockpile, no level of global economic power, no rose-colored memory of a glorious past scrubbed of colonial genocide, enslavement, and rapacious greed. None of that can protect us from the virus's global reach. It's a humiliation. And yes, the pandemic mocks the pretensions even of science and technology and unrestrained capitalism as the ultimate paths toward the good life or the common good, as if the material can fully satisfy the deeper yearnings of the human spirit or promote justice and peace. It's been a humiliation. My Puritan forebears in colonial New England practiced a tradition that they called days of humiliation. These were days set aside in a community for prayer, for fasting, and for hearing the word, lengthy hearing of the word. These days were set whenever a community faced a crisis. It could be any kind of threat, an attack from neighboring indigenous peoples, natural disasters such as a drought, communal discord and hostility of some sort, even the reversal of fortunes for their Puritan sisters and brothers back in Old England, and yes, even plagues. And on these days of humiliation, a special genre of preaching emerged, Humiliation Day sermons. Pastors would quite literally seek to reground the community, the townspeople of the region under the sovereign rule of God, a grounding that led to repentance, and it was hoped reconciliation and a renewal of the entire Commonwealth. Now, I'll be the first to admit that these Humiliation Day Jeremiads would certainly confuse most congregations today at best. American Christians tend to favor sunnier messages, filled with assurances, good feelings, self-regard, and optimism. And most of us, including myself, are tempted to provide what is desired. H. Richard Niebuhr's searing assessment of liberal Christianity in the mid-20th century is still not very far off. He said, "A God without wrath brought men without sin into a kingdom without judgment through the ministrations of a Christ without a cross." And humiliation doesn't quite fit that sentiment. Now, our leaders are framing the pandemic as a war, assuring us that we will ultimately prevail, we will win, we will succeed. It's a metaphor that's guaranteed to lure us back to the same old vanities, the same old pretensions that so diminished life prior to this crisis. But if, at its foundation, this pandemic is not a war, but a humiliation, then it seems to me that as the immediate crisis moves toward a more chronic condition, that as the current expressions of goodness and shared responsibility for one another's safety and welfare begin to inevitably fray under economic and political pressures, and yes, we're seeing that already, it will be imperative for religious leaders to engage congregations and communities in the reality of this humiliation. Any form of truth-telling in our congregations must, of course, be accompanied by pastoral sensitivity, but I hasten to remind us that the latter cannot dissuade us from the former. We mostly lack the kind of penitential rites that were once more common in churches that provided the grounding so essential to the Christian life. But in their absence, I wonder what kind of practices and rituals can we find to help congregations explore the deeper meanings that God may be offering to us in the midst of this biological and social disaster. Paul Tillich famously described God as the ground of being. How can we help our congregations, grounded congregations today, how can we reflect on our own grounded lives so that together we can use this experience once more to again discover how to stand firmly, not in the clouds of our illusions, but rather on the true ground of being, in all of its blessing, all of its holiness, and all of its righteousness. I'd like to invite us now to a time of reflection together, reactions to what I've said, or insights as to how you have either experienced this kind of move toward a truth-telling of meaning, or how you might see that happening through you in your own communities of faith. And obviously you can either do that on the chat box or jump in and share through your audio. So I invite